Former UN envoy Peter Galbraith, who you saw in David Martin's piece, is in our London bureau and joins us now. Your former boss at the UN, the man who fired you, has now said that there was, quote, widespread fraud in Afghanistan's presidential election. Do you feel vindicated?
Well, it is belated recognition of facts that we were telling him on the 21st of August and that he consistently downplayed. I think it's unfortunate that it took 7 weeks for him to come out and say it.
Why do you think he consistently downplayed this?
Well, he has very good relations with President Karzai, so that was certainly one factor. He was afraid, and I understand this concern, that talking about fraud might inflame tensions in the country, but the reality is that Afghans knew the fraud had taken place, and so my view is much better to face up to that reality and then try to deal with it, and this is what finally has happened.
Do you think he intentionally concealed this information?
I will say he initially denied that there had been much fraud. He consistently downplayed it. Even as late as a week ago, when he spoke to the Security Council, he simply said there had been irregularities and fraud committed by all sides, which of course missed the main story, which is that there was massive fraud and committed overwhelmingly on behalf of President Karzai.
Do you think he should be now removed from his position as a result?
Well, he certainly doesn't have any credibility with the large number of Afghans who did not vote for President Karzai, and Abdullah Karzai's main challenger has publicly expressed no confidence in him. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to do what the UN envoy needs to do, which is to play the role of a neutral arbitrator now that the elections are process is going forward or over, and to try and reconcile both sides. If you don't have credibility with one side, it's very hard to play the role of the peacemaker, which is the UN role.
Why do you think he's coming clean now?
Well, the facts are just overwhelming.
You know, he could no longer insist that fraud didn't occur?
Well, the evidence for the fraud was overwhelming. The Election Complaints Commission, which is this UN-backed Afghan body, has been going through the ballots. They've been doing an audit. They clearly have found evidence of substantial fraud, and I think it's likely that there will now be a runoff. So I take his acknowledgement, belated acknowledgement of fraud, as a sign that he knows what's coming, that there will be a runoff.
To give Americans some perspective, Mr. Galbraith, how widespread was this fraud, and tell us what it primarily consisted of?
The fraud was extensive. It consisted primarily of votes from what I call ghost polling centers. That is to say, polling places that never actually opened, but which nonetheless recorded a large number of votes. In some of the provinces of Afghanistan, including Kandahar, which has the Afghanistan's second largest city, we and the UN estimated that there were 4 to 10 times as many votes reported as voters actually cast them. The European Union monitors have estimated that up to one third of Karzai's votes were fraudulent.
So you think a runoff should be held?
Well, it should be held if the mathematics indicate it, but a runoff is not going to be a solution to this fraud-damaged election process unless steps are taken now to ensure that the runoff is cleaner than the vote that was held on August 20th. And that means two things. First, it means closing down the ghost polling centers, places that reported returns but where nobody voted. And second, it means firing the staff of the Election Commission that ran the election, because in every case, it was the Election Commission staff that committed the fraud, collaborated with those who committed the fraud, or knew about the fraud and failed to report it.
If a runoff were to be held, do you believe President Karzai is irreparably damaged as a result of these allegations and substantiated cases of fraud?
Well, I hope he's not irreparably damaged if, in fact, he turns out to be to win the runoff. But there's no question that that the fraud that took place, which incidentally was preventable if the United Nations had done its job, has damaged the confidence of Afghans in the election process, and therefore certainly their confidence that the final result reflects their will.
I guess the question is, would Karzai win in a runoff?
Well, I prefer not to comment on that for the simple reason that my point is, regardless of who wins, the Afghan voters were entitled to an honest tabulation of the vote, and I didn't take a position on who should be the president.
What do you think of the possibility of a power-sharing agreement between Dr. Abdullah and President Karzai? Is that possible in your view?
Dr. Abdullah has categorically rejected such a power-sharing arrangement. What he has talked about is constitutional change, where power sharing would be entrenched in the Constitution, with a president, but also with a prime minister chosen by the parliament, and with a higher degree of local self-government. And I think some solution like that might be possible.
The election was 2 months ago. Are you concerned that a further delay could cause even more instability, or do you think it's more important to get it right?
Well, getting it wrong is going to be the worst possible situation, because the large number of Afghans that did not support Karzai will not accept that result. And there's an ethnic dimension to this. Karzai comes from the largest ethnic group, the Pashtuns, whereas Dr. Abdullah is identified with the second group, the Tajiks. And so not getting the election right could alienate the Tajiks. So that's the most important point. But it also would be very good to get this done as quickly as possible, because winter is approaching. It's not possible to have a runoff after, say, mid-November, and if it isn't done by then, it means this political crisis will continue till next summer, and that will be a disaster both for the people of Afghanistan and for the international military effort.
President Karzai said Sunday that, quote-unquote, foreign propaganda was holding up the process. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, he is continually trying to deflect the blame for the fraud that was committed on his behalf by suggesting that this is just a bad news story, that it's a foreign propaganda. When I tried to intervene to preserve the integrity of the electoral process, he complained that I was engaged in foreign interference. This, incidentally, in an election that the international community, and above all the Americans, had paid $300 million to conduct, and in a country where 100,000 troops are fighting on behalf of the Afghan government. So this has been a continuing theme on his part, and it should not be taken at all seriously. In fact, one should speak firmly to him and say this is unacceptable. Should
the Obama administration, in your view, have been tougher when evidence of fraud first surfaced?
I don't want to speak about what the Obama administration should have done. I worked for the United Nations, and certainly the United Nations could have done something to prevent the fraud before it took place. I tried to do that, but my boss, Couric, stopped me. It should have immediately reported the fraud to the Afghan institutions after the election took place. He stopped that. And it should have intervened, as I did, to try and get the Independent Election Commission, which was a pro-Karzai body, to stick to its procedures and exclude the fraudulent ballots from the initial count. Again, Couric sided with Karzai when he protested my effort to keep the IEC with its established procedures.
You tried to challenge the election in the process. Why do you think you faced roadblocks at every turn?
I think it was the head of the mission who did not want to upset his relationship with President Karzai.
Do you think that Hamid Karzai can lead Afghanistan?
I think it's going to be very tough for him to lead Afghanistan, because he will, if he emerges from this process as the next president, he will somehow have to persuade the people who did not vote for him that he is the legitimate president. And given all the fraud, that's going to be a tough sell.
If he does win a runoff, what more could the U.S. and the UN do to root out corruption in his government?
Well, the U.S. and the UN, I think, should consider conditioning assistance to concrete steps to rout out corruption. I would also say that it should encourage power sharing, genuine power sharing, not just putting people into the cabinet based on a program that involves having professionals as ministers, professionals as governors, and moving away from a system that has significant numbers of political cronies.
Secretary of State Clinton told me last week that the U.S. has got to expect more from President Karzai. So do you think there should be benchmarks, or there should be some kind of close monitoring system? What?
There are 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, most of them American, fighting on behalf of the Afghan government, which may well be led by Karzai. Of course, the United States should insist on improved performance from President Karzai. This is not the government of Afghanistan with regard to corruption and effective government. This is not just a matter for Afghanistan. It is a matter for the United States, because our men and women are there fighting, and his corruption and ineffectiveness makes that task much more difficult.
President Karzai's main rival, Dr. Abdullah, has called for an inquiry into the UN's role in this election. Do you think that's a good idea?
Absolutely, although I think it should be an internal inquiry within the United Nations. It has to look at a situation where the head of the mission consistently downplayed fraud in a UN-backed election, where he blocked steps that might have prevented the fraud, and frankly, where the UN then chose to remove a senior official, myself, because I disagreed privately about how we handled fraud. I think all those things are worthy of an inquiry.
You said last week that President Obama should not approve General McChrystal's request for 40,000 additional troops. Why? In order for the U.S. counterinsurgency in order for the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan to work, we need to have a credible partner. And given all the fraud, President Karzai is not going to be a credible partner. He doesn't have credibility with a large segment of the country. So you think that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And under those circumstances, the additional troops can't accomplish the mission that they're being assigned.
So you think in any event, this needs to be hammered out, the political situation, before more troops are deployed?
The United States needs to have a credible partner in Afghanistan before the additional troops can accomplish their mission. And under these circumstances, with all this fraud, President Karzai is not going to be a credible partner.
And what's next for you, Peter Galbraith?
I don't know. But I imagine I'll resume my previous life. I'll be writing some business activities. And I'll go home to Vermont, and I expect to be involved in public life in my own state in some way or another.
Are you disillusioned, given your experience?
Well, I'm unhappy about what happened to me, but I remain a strong believer in the United Nations and in its mission, and I'm certainly a believer in the wonderful people that I worked with who have been in Afghanistan for years, who know so much about the country, and who risk their lives every day to help the people of Afghanistan. Frankly, the staff of the UN is inspirational, and it deserved better leadership in its mission in Afghanistan than it got.
Some people think that this has hardly helped the UN's reputation, which to many is already significantly tarnished.
I think that's unfortunate. It's something of the UN's own making. It's a self-inflicted wound. I understand how people say that, but the UN remains an important institution, and because of this incident, people shouldn't lose confidence in the UN.
Peter Galbraith, thank you very much for your time.
Well, Katie, very good to talk to you. Thank you.